Good afternoon, everybody. Jeff Jackson, Alfalfa and Forage Specialist with Cropland by Winfield United. Just want to do a quick, well, we'll see how quick it is, but a live Facebook feed here today. Talk a little bit about some drought conditions and feed. Been quite a few calls and conversations the last few days from guys in the North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, maybe parts of Colorado. You just looked at the old drought monitor map again this week, and it's pretty nasty in some places. You know, and even a few places got some moisture Friday, Saturday. It was dry enough that a half inch or even a quarter inch that they did get really didn't make the impact that they needed. So there's been a lot of questions over the last 3-4 days about, hey, we've got this wheat that's not going to make it, whether it be spring wheat, winter wheat, some oats, cereal grains in general, I would say. So there's been a lot of question about, okay, so it's drought stressed. What do we do from here? So I just want to run through, I think the big reason for today's little Facebook Live is just to give you some things to think about. I don't know all the answers, so I'm not going to cover everything probably, and you're still going to have some questions. But please use this as a tool to get the thought process started, to start talking about how to handle these drought-stressed crops and what we can do as alternatives going down the road here. So first thing to talk about, drought stress. We all know that drought stress in these crops, they've been fertilized hopefully to help take care of them and be profitable at the end of the day and have grain production and maybe some straw production. And nobody really wanted to plan ahead for harvesting a drought-stressed crop. So there's probably some nitrogen out there. So nitrates end up being probably the number one thing to talk about with the drought-stressed crop. The nitrates accumulated in that crop, grass species primarily, so all of these wheats, triticales, barleys, oats, any of those that are cereal grain crops right now looking at could have a nitrate problem. So first thing would be this: if you're going to feed that crop or graze that crop, please take a sample and send it in and have a nitrate test done at a lab so that you know what the nitrate levels look like, and you can make an educated guess or decision, after that. So first thing would be is check the nitrates. The nitrates are always going to be higher in the lower stem of the plant. So I've got a couple slides printed out here, so I have some reference material. This goes back to a corn plant. I put this idea together and printed off a couple slides based on information I've had in the past, but just use this as an example. So corn plant. The leaves were taken off a plant and tested for nitrates in a drought situation, and the leaves only has 64 parts per million nitrate. The ear on those plants were only 17 parts per million nitrate. So we know where the sink is going to be. And the upper portion of the stalk, so the upper third of the stalk, was only 153 parts per million nitrate. The middle third of the stalk would have been 800 parts per million. And the lower third of a corn stalk was over 5,500 parts per million. So as we start looking at those numbers, the leaves and the ears only accounted for about 80 parts per million. But the lower portion of that stalk, the lower third, was 5,500. Now, I put a note on here to help mitigate some drought-stressed nitrate issues, just cut it high. Well, I had a phone call from a gentleman just a few minutes ago that said they had wheat that was less than 6 inches tall and putting a head on. It's hard to tell a guy to cut it high, right? So, I get it. Some of those things are going to be out there. You're probably not going to try to harvest that crop at all. It's going to be maybe a grazing situation. But if you're going to try to harvest, here are some things I want you to think about, consider, or take into consideration. If there is some plant height, the higher you cut, the less nitrate will be in there. Remember, when you're taking your samples to send in, you want to cut those samples so it would simulate your harvest process, so that you know what the nitrate will look like in that whole plant material that you plan to send in. And maybe you want to split that sample into thirds and do the top third, the middle third, and the bottom third, and you can get an idea as well of what your samples on your operation will look like. So keep that in mind as you're going through it, that again, the lower third of that plant stem or the stalk is going to be the highest concentration of nitrates. So cut it a little higher when you can. Second thing I would tell you is that if, and this seems like an oxymoron to say it again, but if you can take wet feed, meaning baleage or chop it for silage, and some of those acres, when I say wet feed, you just basically say, man, it's burnt up already. How can I can't even harvest it as a wet feed because it's already that dry. Why we would do that is because through fermentation, so then we have this other special nick in here. If you can get it to ferment, which would be probably from 60 to 70, 72% moisture, you can reduce the nitrates in that crop or in that stored feed by 30 to 40%. So again, if you had 6,000 out there and you could take 40% of that out, now you only have 3,600 parts per million. So you can reduce it by quite a little bit. So fermented wet feed, so baleage or chopped for silage, stored properly. Remember to use an inoculant if you're in that good window where it's going to ferment well. If you're going to try to do that stored feed but it's still a little bit wet but not quite dry, you should consider using a buffered propionic acid. So you want to preserve the crop so it doesn't mold because it's not going to ferment properly. If you have the right moisture, you can use a fermenter, an inoculant. If it's on one end or the other where it's way too wet or way too dry, you need to use a preservative to not allow mold, bacteria, and yeast growth in there. So a couple things to think about. So again, cut it high, make wet feed when you can. When you do dry feed, so if we go swath it, bale it dry, whatever nitrate is in that plant, as you dry it and it does not ferment, it will stay in that plant. So again, a test. Test it before you cut so you know what you have. Test it again before you feed it so you know what's happened to those nitrates in that plant. And don't just rely off of one sample. Please, please, please take multiple samples, multiple tests. If you run up $100 in testing, that's still way cheaper than livestock off feed, aborted calves. I can't tell you all the other things that could happen, but it's time well spent, money well spent to do a test. So a few of those pieces, 30% fermented. So if we're going to do dry hay, we're going to bale it. We know what's in the bale. If you think you're going to graze cows out there, do me a favor. Do not turn out hungry cows. The worst thing you can do is turn them out hungry. They go gorge themselves, get in some high nitrate feed, get sick, go off feed, abort calves, do weird things. You don't want to have that. So make sure you get some fresh, good feed into those cows before you send them out. And maybe, if you're lucky, I know I'm going to say this and everybody's going to go, hey, dude, we don't have time for that. But if you can limit the time they spend on that potentially high nitrate crop, that would also be beneficial. So again, it would be letting them out for a certain amount of time. Don't let them out hungry if you can. If you have some grass hay around, try to get some grass hay in those drought-stressed fields as well, so that if you're turning cows out, they have something to eat that won't give them a stomach ache. And if they start feeling a little bit sick, they can go get some hay off of a fresh grass hay bale or something like that, and you don't have those problems. So again, I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not a veterinarian. Hell, I barely even make a good forage guy at times. So I'm out here trying to tell you some things to get you to think about. Talk to your vet, talk to your feed guy, make a plan, get these samples taken. And so I've got also printed in front of me the chart that shows nitrate levels and what that means for feeding mature cattle. So basically, if you get from 0 to 1,000, it says it's safe to feed if adequate feed and water are available. From 1,000 to 1,500, it's safe for non-pregnant animals. Limit to 50% of the total ration dry matter for pregnant animals. Animals could go off feed and have a slow drop in production. Some abortions are possible. If you're 1,500 to 2,000, limit again to 50% of the total ration of dry matter for all animals. You may experience some symptoms and possibly death. So keep that in mind. We want to stay less than 1,000, 1,500 probably going into these cows. 1,500 to 2,000, limit to 50% of the total ration. Oh, I just talked about that. See, I can't even tell where I'm at. 2,000 to 3,500, limit to 35 to 40% of the total dry matter ration. Do not feed pregnant animals. 3,500 to 4,000, limit to 25% of the total ration. Again, do not feed pregnant animals. And if you're greater than 4,000, this is toxic, do not feed. So again, I think part of that message is the solution to pollution is dilution. So if you have other feedstuffs on the farm that you can blend, mix, commingle somehow, at least have fresh hay in a field if you think you have to go graze those crops. But again, I'm going to circle back to one of the first comments I made. Take samples. Find out where you're at. Be diligent to make sure you're taking care of that livestock. So alternative feed source and fresh water are going to be important. I also know that you get into some of these areas where fresh water in a drought situation is hard to come by as well. So another thought, make sure you're checking those stock dams and know that you have good fresh water out there for those animals. The blue algae can become a problem at times. Again, I know a little bit, but I don't know everything. Hopefully that stimulates a few thoughts for you guys. You know, great point. Somebody just added in here. Another good point in these conditions, have a good protein tub out there. So they have some good, protein nutrition. So go ahead and read the comments, post some questions. And by all means, everybody share this with any friends if you think this little short video is useful. But the comments and questions, don't be afraid to ask the questions. Don't be afraid to answer some questions and throw your input in there. That's what this is all about. So let's just be aware that these drought conditions are happening. What can we do to take care of these guys? And use this as a tool to help people be aware and just make good management decisions so that we don't have reproductive problems. We don't have these aborted calves, and we can keep everybody on the right trajectory. I mean, the worst thing is to add insult to injury. So for everybody out there, God bless. Have a good day. Hopefully this little video sparks some thoughts and some conversation out there so we can help keep everybody safe. So from Jeff Jackson and the Cropland Forage team, everybody have a good day. Thank you. Stay tuned. We'll add another one some other day down the road, of course, right? Thank you all.